first time I met a certain local minister, we were both attending an NAACP police accountability session here in Chandler. After it was over, we chatted a little, and she asked what Unitarian Universalism was all about. Now, being a proud evangelical Unitarian Universalist, that is my favorite question. So, little did she know what she was in for. I did my little elevator speech. We have many theological positions and spiritual traditions, including agnosticism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, and more. And we gather around shared values like inherent worth and dignity for every person. As often happens in these conversations, the next question was about the afterlife. My colleague was stunned to learn that while some Unitarian Universalists believe in an afterlife, some do not. But as a faith, we have rejected the idea of hell. She was stunned. We've since had a few conversations about the differences in our faith traditions, but we also work on projects we both value, like fighting racism and policing. This sort of encounter happens somewhat frequently in the work that I'm blessed to do. As co-president of Tempe Interfaith Fellowship, for example, I work with Mormons and Muslims, Jews and Protestant Christians and Catholics. We even put on an annual interfaith Thanksgiving service to benefit local work to alleviate homelessness. But in that group, a tricky question came up. We like to begin our meetings with a prayer or meditation. One way to do that in such a theologically diverse group is to make all of our prayers sound the same. Avoid any mention of the parts of our faith that make us unique so as not to offend one another. Or sing everything. People will sing what they will not say. Or say everything in another language. Well, theological tiptoeing, you might call it. An ASU student tried this in one interfaith meeting. She offered a lovely prayer. And at the end of it, she said, "In Jesus' name, crap, sorry." Only she didn't say crap. Well, wanting to avoid crap sorry moments in which people of good faith and open hearts feel the need to paper over their tradition, my co-president, who's a Presbyterian minister, suggested that we all pray in the fashion that suits our faith tradition, knowing that we're not pressuring one another to convert. I like his suggestion because I think that is true pluralism. And on this last Sunday of exploring the theme of respect, I want to reflect for a few moments on respect for diversity in the form of pluralism. I think it's important right off to distinguish between diversity on the one hand and pluralism on the other. They are not the same thing. As religion scholar Diana Eck has written, diversity is a fact, but pluralism is an achievement. It is simply true, for example, that we are a diverse nation in just about every way. But, in the words of a Unitarian Universalist adult religious education session on the topic of pluralism, pluralism is more than diversity. While diversity is good, it doesn't say anything about how diverse people interact. We can be diverse and segregated, or diverse and fighting. Pluralism is when diversity is acknowledged and engaged toward positive ends by the diverse people. That same UU religious education curriculum suggests that religiously pluralistic community has three aspects. The first, and I think foundational aspect of pluralism, is respect for religious identity, which means people respect the fact that religion exists and they respect the ways religious identity shows up around them. My colleague, who didn't agree with the UU dismissal of hell, could have stopped working with me then and there, but I'm glad she didn't. It can be helpful to have a mantra like, "I will be curious, not defensive." I will be curious, not defensive. Because curiosity really is the goal in pluralism, I think. When we're able to get to curiosity, when we're unafraid of being changed by the experience and not needing to change the other person, then we can truly respect religious identity. The second aspect of pluralism, according to the authors, is mutually inspiring relationships, which, again, quoting this curriculum, means people have relationships where they can fundamentally disagree about some things, but support and admire one another across lines of difference. A relationship in which you expect only to enlighten the other person without being inspired or transformed even yourself is not so conducive to pluralism. We have so much to learn from one another across the religious spectrum. In fact, across all the artificial divides that seem to keep us apart. When we can overcome fear, again, and get to curiosity about our differences, transformational learning can take place. So pluralism means respect for religious identity, mutually inspiring relationships. The third aspect is what the authors of this curriculum call common action for the common good. This happens when religiously diverse communities get together to act for the things they commonly believe in, such as ending war or poverty. One example of that is found weekly right here at VUU. We participate in the Chandler Interfaith Homeless Emergency Lodging Program. Just about every week now, we house 20 or so homeless guests, feeding them a meal and giving them our space to sleep. Only we don't always provide the meal. Sometimes a Mormon congregation, which cannot provide housing, comes to VUU and provides the meal. Sometimes folks from a Chandler mosque, who again cannot provide space for sleeping, cook the food and bring it here to serve it. One of the women from the mosque came last night to a different mosque because she knew we were there and talked to me a bit. It is a wonderful opportunity for us to work together toward a shared goal, even though these folks would not share all of our goals. Maybe this is not always our strongest suit. In 1999, the UUA's General Assembly passed a statement of conscience entitled Beyond Religious Tolerance. The challenges of interfaith cooperation begin with us. Some of you have been around Unitarian Universalism long enough to remember that the battle between atheistic humanism and theistic Unitarian Universalism was once terribly heated. That battle was in the background of this statement, which reads in part, "Contemporary Unitarian Universalism is a pluralistic faith, drawing from its strength from its openness to many different sources. While religious interdependence is an integral characteristic of our living tradition, we are not immune to religious intolerance. There is still hard work to be done within our ranks to ensure that Unitarian Universalists with different theological and philosophical beliefs feel equally at home in our congregations." It concludes, "We need to grow beyond the stereotypes, symbols, and semantic barriers that divide Unitarian Universalists from one another." End quote. So it becomes clear that the struggle for pluralism is not easy, even within Unitarian Universalism. But we stick together around our covenants, and we keep communicating, and we keep telling one another our stories, and we stay curious about why in the world, for example, a minister who calls himself a humanist Christian would call himself a humanist Christian. Some of you have asked me that in pretty much that language. Or why an atheist or agnostic, and we welcome many of you. If you fall into those camps, you're not even close to alone here. Why an atheist or agnostic would want to be part of a congregation like this one. Again, when we can move past fear to curiosity, these questions and their answers become fascinating and enlightening, not scary, not sources of unhealthy conflict. Pluralism, more than just diversity, begins with respect for others' identity, features mutually inspiring relationships, and at its best includes action for the common good. Always it requires us to overcome fear in favor of curiosity. But there are limits to religious tolerance, to embracing of diversity, even in Unitarian Universalism. Let me quote that 1999 statement once more. The commitment of Unitarian Universalism to religious tolerance dates back to the first guarantee of religious freedom in Europe, issued in 1568 by the Transylvanian king John Sigismund, a Unitarian. We talked about him last week. Today, we accept others' rights to their own beliefs. However, our acceptance of others does not extend to tolerance of actions flowing from those beliefs that violate individual human rights and dignity. Acceptance thrives only where mutual respect exists. Understanding is encouraged, and dialogue is nurtured among people of different faiths and philosophical traditions. End quote. We are a proud, liberal religious tradition. That does not mean that everyone here is a fiscal or political liberal. It does mean, however, that we will interpret world and community events in light of our belief that every person is born with worth and dignity. Our belief that we do not exist outside community, but are in fact interdependent, not just with one another, but with the earth that we share. We are the people of the free pulpit who call our ministers to speak the truth as they see it. We're the people of the free pew. Very clear that not everyone agrees with the minister, that we have the freedom to drive home and talk about what a bad sermon that was and how we don't agree. Freedom of the pew. But more than anything, we are the love people. Here's why that's important. Inclusion of every single person in our movement is not our ultimate goal. I think that is important. Inclusion of every single person in our movement is not our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is for love and justice to be the rule rather than the exception. And for that to happen, we'll have to take positions on things. We'll have to be political sometimes. We'll have to speak out against injustice clearly and without equivocation. Pluralism is not a weak-kneed avoidance of taking a position. In fact, pluralism itself requires us to take strong positions against practices and policies which threaten the ability of all people to speak their truths without fear. Despite anti-Muslim executive orders, despite vocal anti-Semitic sentiment, we are not becoming a less pluralistic nation. In fact, numbers released on February 15th show that Americans feel more positively about people of all faiths, including Muslim faith, than they did 3 years ago. For me, the most interesting finding of the Pew survey reported in last week's New York Times was this. In the last 3 years, the percentage of people who reported positive feelings toward Muslims increased by about 8%. And that rise correlated almost directly with another finding. Here's the end of that New York Times story. In every case, people felt more warmly toward religious groups when they personally knew someone in that group. Compared with 2014, the average of Americans who said they personally knew a Muslim had increased to 45% from 38%. The highest increase in personal contact from any religious group. And largely, I think, in part to the work of the Muslim community to form those networks. There is the work of pluralism. It does not just happen. We cannot think our way to either a more pluralistic congregation or a more pluralistic nation. Relationships are the only soil in which pluralism will grow. And relationships require work and tending. Ibu Patel is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps. a Chicago-based organization building the interfaith movement on college campuses. He is in high demand as a speaker and author on the subject of working together across faith difference. He gave the Ware Lecture at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly a few years ago, where he talked about, he told a story from his tradition. You'll recognize parts of it. He said to the Unitarian Universalists there gathered, "So in the Muslim creation story, in Surah 2 of the Holy Quran, we learn that God created humankind with a lump of clay and his breath. And there was Adam, the first human being and representative of all human beings in the Islamic imagination. God beckoned the angels forth and said, I want you to bow to Adam and honor my creation. Honor this human being. And the angels responded by saying, why would we honor a creature who will only fiddle and destroy? And God responds by saying, I know what you do not know. God vouches for Adam, humankind's goodness in the face of the angel's suspicion. And Patel goes on, in that surah, the next verse, God sets up a contest between Adam and the angels. He says to the angels, I want you to tell me the names of creation. The angel's response is, the only knowledge we have is to sing the glories of your name. God then turns to Adam and gives him the same task. Tell me the names of creation. And Adam is able to do it, to name it all. Patel says, I remember in my return to Islam, when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I read that surah. And the term in that surah that stuck out to me was names. It is not singular, it's plural. Creation is not a single name repeated over and over and over again. Creation is many names. Creation is diverse. The quality that Adam had that distinguished him from God's angels, Patel concludes, that actually caused God to strike his own resonance with Adam, to vouch for Adam's goodness, was the ability to flow with diversity. We human beings were made for diversity. And he said, reading UU literature reminded me of that story in the Holy Quran. And for that, I thank you. Friends, Unitarian Universalism is a pluralistic faith. We have a light to shine in this movement at this time. Patel said in an interview several years ago now, long before the 2016 election, the pluralists are in the majority, and yet the totalitarians have succeeded in convincing us to be afraid of each other. The challenge of the faith line is for those of us in the majority to stand up for our pluralist vision, to tell our story, to put the extremists back in their place on the extremes. End quote. I think we must do two things. We must work to make pluralism a reality in our rural areas, in our cities, in our nation, wherever we are. We must make an effort to form relationships with people across perceived differences, to cross the threshold of someone else's house when it's not familiar but you're invited. We must also work to model pluralism here in this congregation, as we did yesterday when 60 of us met and ate and prayed with our friends at the Islamic Community Center of Tempe. It became very clear, you may not be surprised to know, that we do not believe all the same things. But we were happy to share a meal together, to learn from one another, and we'll return that invitation in the coming months. Our nation and this faith are made for pluralism. I think that's for you. God calling, I'm sure. Well, that's the call to pluralism, friends. So let us respond to that call and make pluralism a reality. Amen.